criticism arrogating itself, arrogating to itself the practices of art as being a epistemic closure, whereas Matthew, you were looking at this as something that has a kind of vitality we've yet to reckon with.
Only part that I would, what you just said is right, except for the vitality. I just, to me, it's simply, I think, I would say my obsession at this point is description over interpretation, because I'm profoundly skeptical of our political moment. So my guess is that we simply need to describe and describe and describe, and that someday the descriptions might be useful. And my guess is that my descriptions at this point convince me that many of the activities surrounding what we invoke over and over again is October, whatever that precisely means. What we really mean is a complex that precisely complicates the description of artistic practice, a discursive practice around an artistic practice, and I am not making a claim, my part, whether it's good or bad. I simply see that's what I see. And so I'm glad, I don't know if you share that description.
Say again.
I don't know if you share that description of the...
that one's role is to describe?
Just whether whether this I don't know which noun you would use, confusion or...
Okay.
I think you characterized it in a more pejorative way. I took it.
Yeah. Well, yes, it's this closure didn't sound like
epistemic closure generally is a pejorative.
when you adduced it, and its relation back to the Krauss text, which is just undeniably an historiographical landmark and watershed piece. That is how you got from the beginning to the end, I think, would be worth some further elucidation.
Would be what?
How you got from your premise in the Krauss to this judgment about closure that confuses the activities of criticism with those of art.
I did not say that it confuses the activities of criticism with art. It confuses the activity of viewing art with criticism. I think that meaning is born in the act of reception, and that when you use a certain language set that perpetually obviates any use of particulars, you elide from the very parameters of your discourse, of your language, the possibility of identifying with the work as a viewer on a particular level. And that's the closure I'm referring to.
So it's the imposition or interposition of a degree of abstraction between viewer and the unanticipated stimuli that the work of art is going to offer.
When you, as the critic, establish a unitary meaning for the work of art that becomes unitary because you elide recourse to other forms of language, that is the closure I mean. Like, when you say this means this, that is a denotative value, right? But art is connotative.
But why does that stop someone else from saying something different?
That's what discourse does. It halts our ability to think outside of certain parameters, I think.
But,
okay.
Right.
Maybe, but...
Yeah.
I mean,
as I said...
But I mean, I would just, for me, I mean, I think I do grasp very much what you're saying, and for me, I'll use bulletproof again. I think what you're saying is that Krauss came up with these bulletproof, these powerful interpretive structures, And for me, they're not models. They are what they are. They're much closer to works of art. And if we view them that way, not as something to be appropriated and used by others for professional advancement, then they hold their water fairly well to me. Whereas if one construes them to be principally models to be appropriated and used in the future, then they are oppressive. But that might be a good thing, because then it will stop people from continuing to do it.
And I think that's what's happening now, right? I mean, the people in her sphere were using that model, even as it was a conflict with them to do so. I mean, Owen says this pretty much in the discourse of others, right? That he doesn't, I don't think, well, he does, no, the unitary view central to that discourse precluded him from entering into it from the point of the particular, be it his own or from, from a feminist perspective that he only engaged upon leaving October.
Let me see if I have this straight, Ted.
Yeah.
So you have an idea of history as plenitude, and that we must somehow approach it. And anything that doesn't follow that path is somehow an act of repression or disavowal or foreclosure. I mean, I'd like the people interested in psychoanalysis to talk about the use of these concepts to think about discursive moves too. But let me just finish. As opposed to methods that might emerge at a particular historical moment for particular historical reasons that might be adapted academically, oppressively down the road, Matthew, but might also remain, methods that one can use, tools that one can use for particular objects when appropriate. I mean, the paranoia in your arguments is so enormous. Well, more on you later.
Oh, wow, okay.
But let me just say that, what all that Krauss wants to do in this text, and I think it was generative, it's a fairly simple and brilliant move of deconstruction. That's all it is, and it's not as if you have to sign on to it. It's not as if that one move means that all other methods are disproven somehow.
How I'm sorry.
But how is deconstruction a method? Okay, you realize I'm using the same methods, right, to bring the discourse about that I'm doing. So in fact, I am using her method, but I'm doing it in such a way that does not elide the particular, whereas hers consistently did. And another thing...
Does elide mean, I'm just thinking back to French class. And,
yeah.
But in this larger metaphoric use of the term, does it mean disguise, obscure, conjoin at the expense of articulation? Is that what you mean?
I mean that it makes it unspeakable by the logic of the argument.
What?
Unspeakable.
Unseekable.
Unthinkable by the logic of the argument.
Well, this is the nub of an interesting form of disagreement here, where the partiality of something is either an open-ended gesture, it goes as far as it goes, but doesn't preclude its being extended or built upon or contradicted, or partiality being seen as a dictum against any other substitute for itself. And this has to be two very divergent descriptions of the same object, the same kind of object.
I think, though, that we have to look, and I think Ted is looking at Krauss's career as a whole, talking about this one particular text to be sure, but looking at the career as a whole. And I think it a bit disingenuous to sort of pose this simply as one perspective that doesn't really affect or do anything to other perspectives, because in fact, Krauss was quite explicit and articulate about various forms of what I understand as well as foreclosure. And I am particularly noting, for example, a dismissal of my own work in which she said that lesbian and gay studies has never done anything interesting in art history. So there is a regulatory mechanism that was built into it.
You are bringing in something outside this particular argument, which
Yes.
Ted is claiming does that, though the evidence for it lies outside the essay.
Maybe being a Soviet specialist, I have a slightly harsher judgment on how you foreclose or elide. Can't you just walk down the hall and still make your argument? I mean, really, I don't see how it's so repressive. I do understand there's institutional power in it, and it expresses itself, and it has, and I think you can be sympathetic, more than sympathetic. You can even align yourself with, broadly speaking, October's methods, whatever that means, and still be cognizant of the fact that it did have, I think, the historical effect of slowing the process of diversification of points of view that were viable for pursuit in our field. That's where I would place myself.
But that's just a matter of stress.
Yeah.
I mean, you're not fundamentally disagreeing with...
Well, yeah,
I'm taking, what I'm hearing sounds as if it's not more of a sociological description of the mechanisms of power. It sounds as if it's a covert attempt to say that the method itself somehow exerted these forms of repression.
Allison, did you have a comment? Could you say it again? You need the mic, though.
Well, no. I was going to say exactly what you just said. So there's no need for me to say anything with this microphone, except that I did notice that I did notice another thing, which I don't know how valid this is anymore after a few minutes have passed. But I was thinking as this was going on that there's this funny dynamic of perhaps it's a question of convenience in people's positions. I'm not sure that you know. Sometimes we want to claim that texts are very powerful things, and sometimes we want to pretend that, oh, no, it's just a text, you know? So I just was noticing this dynamic was happening here. And maybe there's some place in between that where things really are. But, you know, this sort of, oh, no, it's just a text, you know?
It's very easy to fall into saying that.
Yeah. And then there's another position saying, no, this text is a domineering object. You know,
yeah,
so
I mean, the history of sexuality is just a text, right? No,
right.
It changes everything.
So I don't think it's either one of those things, I suspect. So
That's very well observed. Yeah, Paul, who I remember memorably reviewed the collection that this essay was in, didn't you coin the term gridomania to
I can't.
carry?
Senior moment, I can't remember. But I mean, I can't actually remember that much about that review either. But just going back to something Matthews said there about how did you put it? I can't remember. It was very, very sort of compressed and sort of elegant thing about it was what was done with it rather than the method that was oppressive. Some sort of statement like that. Well, I am not so sure because I mean this isn't really my strong suit. It never was, and it certainly isn't now. But we've talked a couple of times, I can't remember whether it's earlier today or in this discussion over dinner last night, but about the relationship of social history of art to postmodernist criticism in a sort of different sense of the word, and how the sort of differences between them might not be as great as was once thought. Well, in this particular instance, I think it does dramatise the differences between them. And when I wrote that review in whenever it was, 1985 or something like that, a long, long time ago, there was a sense in which certainly the social history of art as it came through, the institution that I work for, that's been mentioned a few times, Open University, the early social history of art often sort of saw itself as deployed against a certain kind of formalism, usually Greenbergian formalism, and the way it sort of theorized modernism. But the Krauss thing seemed to be like that in a sort of, updated way, in a sense. So there did seem to be a sense where there was a kind of a methodological conflict to do with social context and that kind of set of issues on the one hand, and what seemed to me and to the wider circle that I was part of to be a kind of restriction. And I remember a colleague of mine from a very long time ago arguing it was to do with the absence of a social semiotics from Krauss's approach. And there was a kind of methodological limitation in the version of semiotics that she was employing. So, and I mean, I don't know what it looks like now, but certainly at that point, there did seem to be some kind of conflict in the real world between what we thought we were doing and what that text appeared to be doing.
Well, you've said it in a way, Paul. I think that's important, but I guess I come at it from a rather different tack, because I thought what you were attacking there, Ted, was a formalism. And did you use the term universal signifier? Mm-hmm. Well, my problem with that is manifold, but my first thought was, and maybe this isn't necessarily a problem of a social history of this set of debates, but it's as if that text was really crucial, but this was a discursive framework in formation. The kind of mobility of that sense of, if we are thinking about what I took to be our object here, which is trying to map something, we have a kind of discursive framework in formation which subsequently disintegrates for whatever reason. And here we are in this kind of, in some ways, I'm surprised and interested in the level of Matthew's, real deep and I think interesting skepticism about the moment that we are living and what's possible and what's not. That really has a kind of power. But rather than that model being kind of finished, the whole point about the signifier was that it made it impossible to conjoin it with the word universal. Right. And actually that you are yourself reinscribing in that a universalism. No, you've missed the emphasis of the essay.
I mean, what I'm saying is that she is doing that. She is producing.
I know you're saying that she's doing that, but I think you are making her text, which I would not want to use now, nor deploy a structuralist model, but you're making her text mimic your own projections about a certain kind of formalism that may or may not be true, but I don't think you can actually take it back to her notion of the way the signifier functions.
May I say, just intervene very quickly here? I think Paul is absolutely right that there were other models of semiotics, social semiotics. Yeah, Mukharovsky, for one. I mean, there was a whole other line that October could have developed, others could have developed, and they did not. But that's what I really wanted to stress is the point that Bryony made, that these are critical moments, theoretical interventions. They are very partial, and maybe there are real power effects in the text and in reception. But this is a discourse really in formation. It's the crimp is in October 15, winter 1980. The Krauss, October 18, fall 1981. And they're fundamentally in contradiction. Crimp says, in effect, he reads Benjamin to say, in effect, that the copy undoes the original, that the copy somehow undoes aura. And that's not true even to the Benjamin. Benjamin has a really important footnote in the artwork essay in which he says there's no real concept of the original without the copy. And that's really the line that Krauss takes up, that, very simply, that repetition is the ground for originality. So the discourse is in such formation that two primary players in the creation of this discourse are fundamentally in contradiction, and they don't really know it yet. So, this is where I think we have to underscore the difference between a critical intervention at X date and a historical, theoretical retrospect that, in a way, almost asks too much of the discourse in the moment and begins to use terms which are very powerful terms, like repression, foreclosure. You know what foreclosure is psychoanalytically? It's a psychotic operation where the real is foreclosed and returns in the guise of an hallucination. Now, if you really want to take that concept on and say that that's what these texts produce, that's a very strong statement.
I don't think it's quite fair to say that, this was information and therefore we can't read it as something that's done. And I mean, why is that the basis upon which we should not take seriously what's written there? Or that's one issue. The other problem is the other problem is just as if I think part of this very question is coming from the material itself, because the writing that we're talking about, some of this early 80s writing that was done, and specifically in October, but not just in October, was trying to be more than just criticism in a narrow sense. If you want to talk about what something was trying to be at a certain moment, it seemed like it had ambitions that were actually larger than merely some, instantaneous act of criticism. There were larger ambitions regarding theory and history that were happening in those pages, and I think that maybe what's coming out in the reading. Am I wrong, Ted? I don't know if there was something larger of an ambition there than merely. I don't think it's fair to now characterize it that it was only in the moment and this was information. I don't think that's quite fair.
Yeah, and unfortunately, in discussing Krauss's text, you can't talk about the more social-oriented texts that you produced, that Craig Owens produced, that Douglas Crimp produced around the same time, right? And in those texts, the universalizing of the social takes place as well. You may, and I don't mean just you, I mean the people writing in this moment, there may be a framing that says, okay, this is an image of a woman, and then this refers to representations of women in the media. But like I keep saying, the point, the thesis of the argument always takes place at the point of the universal. It always takes place at the point of the self or the subject, which is to erase, to elide, to occlude from view critically the particular terms of the social. That ideological interpolation that we're referring to is taking place. Because despite the fact that there is ideology, there are still material effects to that ideology that are different from person A as a man, from person B as a gay man, person C as a woman, right? And these are material and felt effects. And when we just talk about ideology as though it has a universal meaning, right? As though, that's ideology. To speak in universal terms, it's not you're not actually saying anything, because the meaning is not grounded in any kind of rooted particularity. That's meaning.
I just wanted to lend a little flesh to this abstract conversation by noting that I think what Ted is addressing is the use of terms like the viewer or the spectator. which appears very often in Krauss's writing. And this is where I disagree with you, Brian E., respectfully, because it does seem that in using terms like the viewer or the spectator, and then describing a series of operations that the viewer or the spectator does, there is an implicit sort of universalization of a singular critical subjectivity as determinative. And that's, I think, what Ted is getting at.
Yeah, and I would add that, citing Leclau again, the universal has no content. This is the universal.
Grab a mic.
Sure, thank you. As he says in so many words, the universal is an empty platform without any content inherent to itself. And it stands so that particular groups, particular people, can momentarily represent their interests, their particular interests, as a universal. Okay? And so it's only in relation to the particular that a universalization can even mean anything. So this is what I mean when I say when we make the thesis at the point of the universal, we actually unroot it from any particular grounded meaning.
And if I could just add one more thing, and that's about Matthew, whom I adore. One of the things that I adore about Matthew's presentations is that the tone, the body language, the whole persona that Matthew adopts in speaking is so poised at the cusp of ironic affirmation and dismissal that he allows us, this extraordinary room, in a beautiful homology to his critical project at large, to make of him what we want. And that's the obverse operation.
Let me put this in. I just grabbed the microphone because I want to put this in another way. I was holding off because it's always fun to talk about positions, but I didn't want us to lose sight of the fact that we have an interesting positionlessness here. There are varieties. Yes, we do. Yes, we do. So am I. There are lots of varieties of positionlessness, and they could give us different form to our conversation. I mean, it is fun to argue positions when they can be seen. But for example, Brian said of you that you have skepticism. I think was one of the words that you used. Skepticism could lead in different directions. Might not lead you to say, as you did of Hal, something like an unparaphrasable thing, which you said he's an actor in discourses, or anyway.
He's a discourse performer.
A discourse performer. Thank you very much. Yes. So I think it might be interesting also to ask about what kinds of interventions into these conversations can be had by positions that disavow their positions at any given moment. You're not assigning people roles in the ways that they normally would. Hal, for example, disagreed with you when you said that.
That's his right to disagree. I think actually, if I recall correctly, I came up with a list of very bold statements. I'm the only person who challenged everybody on stage to do something. Tell me why Boltanski and Capello are completely wrong. It would be great if you could tell me that. So I think I took positions.
Yeah, but for looking to have been bulletproof, as you asserted at the beginning, yes. Maybe I was mishearing you, but I heard a lot of holes by the end.
That would have been an instantiation of the method that Jonathan described. Yes, that's the very playful and endearing irony that I have cultivated.
I actually want to return to this point about universalism, and it brings to mind somewhat painful memory when I was enlisted to speak in a DIA panel about the birth and the death of the viewer by him back in the late 80s. I didn't mean it like that. By Hal. And I was making what I thought was, in the teeth of the Reagan era in 1987, a tactical argument for the value of thinking in more universal terms, or thinking universally across a population who was opposed to, the drift of politics and the culture at that juncture. In distinction to identity politics. And I got my head torn off by that audience. And, way beyond anything that's been witnessed here today. And so it brings back, I hadn't thought about it for a long time, but it comes back to mind as a rejoinder to what Ted had to say. That is to say that the things that distinguish or divide the groups that you are very intent on keeping separate separate in terms of drawing contrasts between.
You're talking about social groups?
Yeah, social groups, the specificity of social groups. Yeah, well then let me just finish the formulation.
Yeah.
Which I think I'm right in hearing you saying that attention to that particularity of experience and processing that people of different identities do in front of a work of art would obviate the universal. But of course, all of those groups, insofar as we're capable of defining them, are distinct in a one or a limited number of dimensions. And they have, at the same time, an equal or if not greater number of things in common.
Yeah,
That is, gender or sexual orientation might be different, but class might be the same. Region might be the same. Age cohort might be the same. And you can, map in all of these different ways. So the only thing that allows you to, speak realistically about a population in a way that takes account of their commonalities as well as their differences would be some form of universalism.
I'm not sure about that. It depends how you mean the universal. As I said, the universal and the particular are inherently bound and also contradictory to one another. That is democracy, that is the movement toward democracy when that takes place. But what the point I was trying to make was that we can begin from contingent foundations, as Judith Butler puts it. But that does not mean that the categories at which we identify contingently at the foundation of our political mobilization need be stable. And I think that by reading the work of art from your particularities, right, the inherent complexities that arise from that, the contradictions that arise from that, blur the distinctions of those categories and enable disidentification.
Well, but
Could be construed, just as to complete the thought, construed as the mobilization of the universal to gather together
Yes.
a greater constituency than any self-identified groups by race or gender or sexual orientation could possibly do.
But it's a universal from the other side. It's not starting at the universal, but it's reaching the universal, which is not truly possible, but by dint of...
Could I intervene?
I couldn't hear you, I'm sorry.
I thought that just needed to be
I
added
agree entirely,
because
yes.
I thought maybe it got
Lost.
foreclosed at the end.
Thank you.
My question, or I guess it's an observation, is that I just find it, for me, it's a bit uncomfortable to discuss these texts as if they're rule books or they're instruction manuals that we are supposed to follow. They're much closer to me to fiction that takes into account objects in the world and then manipulates them in compelling or not so compelling ways. Okay.
Matthew.
I absolutely believe that. I said crazy stuff about Hal just now. I totally believe that. If you look at it as fiction, essentially, that involves a real-world component that is quite, it's completely consistent with many activities in the 20s, for example, in literature. Factography, it's a different form of factography.
Matthew, isn't this a general...
Fictional, more and more.
It takes on more fictional components over
But
time.
Matthew, isn't this a generational divide, which is to say that one of the things, yes, between us.
We're not divided.
Because when I was reading these texts, when the ink was still fresh, it still meant something differently in that context than obviously it meant by the time that you were able to take on these texts. And there were competing formations that you were able to take advantage of. And I think that needs to be...
Yes, he was.
And I think that needs to be taken into account. And,
yes, he agrees with that too.
And Jim's going to be my avatar from here on out.
And towards this question of universality, I just want to also, sort of shout out to Judith Butler's thinking on universality, precisely because one of the things that Butler constantly is now sort of getting us to think through is what happens when somebody in a minoritized position assumes, right, the standpoint epistemology of the universal, and how that act breaks apart as a form of resistance extant code, so that the universal becomes a performative posture. And that, right?
That's right.
That's right.
You just explained it. It's a performative posture.
Yes.
No.
It's a performative posture. It's a performative posture that gives temporary universal representation to a particular person's interests.
But Matthew, there's a difference between a performative posture now and a performative posture then.
Okay. No, no doubt that is absolutely true. My question then is, what does it mean?
What does the universal mean?
I'm going to tell you how it feels, because I was trying to wrap my mind around why I found a lot of the proceedings today sad, and just because in some ways I feel, in a certain degree, that we're not making progress. We're kind of kicking up dust, so to speak. And in some ways, I feel like we are enacting critique, critique of critique, as Latour might say. And there's, it seems that if we have a certain kind of, if certain people have a certain unhappiness or feel that there's a lack in this discourse, it seems to me, following Latour's kind of program of an additive rather than a negative critical practice, the thing would be to perform an alternative that is persuasive, or demonstrate an alternative rather than deconstructing a model.
Did I not close with that in my talk, right?
And let me just suggest that I do think there is actually an extant model of that, but not in critical praxis, but in art. And that is the work of Ryan Trecartin. We just had him at Buffalo. And one of the things that was so striking about Trecartin's work is that it moves with manic intensity through a range of positions, voices, personas. And in having a conversation with Trecartin afterwards about it, I was talking about how I thought brilliantly he instantiated the sort of critical moment through this bombing of any kind of binaristic power relationship with so many possibilities and permutations as to utterly escape reinscription. And that was, for me, incredibly open and powerful as an alternative. And what was amazing about that is that I was crediting him with this sort of critical sophistication about this, and he said, what you don't understand is this is not a thought position, this is a lived position. I'm still wrapping my head around what that means. But that really changed the way I think.
How did it change how you think?
Because I've always assumed that incremental progress turns on some or another form of oppositional praxis. I am built for it. It's what I thought one did to move forward. And here is somebody who says that I'm always going to, as it were, right, win the battle but lose the war that way. And so, sorry for the martial metaphor. And so what we need to do is to really get out of that kind of oppositional thinking and swamp the binary.
So if I follow you correctly, you're saying that Tricarton loses all of the battles, but then might win the war?
Yeah, in some sense.
That's what I think, yeah. I completely agree with that. And that's basically the method that I think is the most resonant today.
That's why the Ludekin was interesting. You know, when you read it and he pops up on eFlux all the time, he seems to just write something every week, kind of. But that it's clearly, and then when you're done with it, you sort of can't find the argument exactly, but I know what he's talking about, you know, but there's not exactly an argument. And I would say, there's like both a network of people described, and this is 2002, but I know who all the people are in 2012. It's like the new person at the Van Abbey, and you know, it's on and on. You know who these people are, and there's a way of acting that I think Matthew is very in tune with, and it is that sort of path of no resistance, you know, and that sort of kind of positionless, which acting. I don't really know how else to describe it, but you see it in criticism that's written today, and you see it in art. And things you like and things that you don't like, and it's kind of amorphous. And so I was interested in
see it?
Pardon?
Just remind me what you mean by the pronoun.
I've lost the it is amorphous too. It's the object of art. It's the artist. It's a kind of critical writing. It's above all a kind of curatorial practice. And it has, and this is why the Bohm resonates, because it's about indeterminacy, unknowing, you know, and a kind of objectless urgency. And so, and these are people I've been on panels with Matthew, but also with Maria Lind, and you know, like any number of sort of international actors and curators, and this is the way they speak, you know. And so the question is, it's kind of attractive, you know, after a long season of polemics, you know, that are often, like Rob said, you don't sort of get anywhere. And that it's the polemics that characterize 75 to 95, I think, those kind of extreme position taking. So then, whether that was really true or whether it only seems true in retrospect. So I guess I'm interested in this as some kind of new thing in response to that. And if there is political value there, or social value, or artistic value, or it's just, you know, bloopy neoliberalism.
It is not neoliberalism on my part at all. No. There's a war going on every day, and there are about 9 billion people who are losing that war every day, and they're going to sooner or later win the war. So, and it won't be because of us. So
what's the relation? So that's super interesting. What's the relationship
we
to
create
this
descriptive
moment?
languages that might have use in the future, maybe not.
I'm trying to measure that against what John Cage said of Robert Rauschenberg, which was that he cuts with a knife in such a way that the person never notes the incision. And what? And so, I mean, what Cage is doing in so much of his work, and this is, forgive me for thinking out loud, this is what I'm trying to sort of parse, is how much of what I'm going to generalize under the proper name of Matthew, how much of Matthew is a kind of camouflaged taking of positions, and how much of it is actually an utter refusal of positionality as simply the treadmill we must get off. Does that make sense?
Would you like to speak into 2 or 3 microphones this time?
Well, okay, the conference is not Art, Ideology, and Matthew, so I'll stop
That's
speaking.
the next conference.
That's the next conference. That'll be a winner. I don't think a lack of, I think it's, I'll go back to the overriding term for me is description. It's descriptive, is that I think we need different descriptions for things we already know. And I think that those new descriptions will allow new forms of knowledge to appear that we cannot predict what they'll do. So it's probably ridiculous to call Hal, I'll go back now, I'm obsessed with Hal, so that if I give a different descriptor to what he's done in his career, so to speak, then perhaps that will open up someone else to see something in the work that I couldn't see. That's my hope. So by all of us describing in provocative and exotic ways at times, and sometimes in very banal, precise ways, we'll have a thickness of description that will allow possibilities to occur. Not us, we won't do it, someone else will.
So Wittgensteinian kind of, right? Is that what you're saying?
No. I don't know, it seems to me closer to, I know there's a maxim in information science that any significant phenomenon is susceptible to at least two powerful forms of description that don't need to agree. And that's always stuck in my mind, and I think that it has potential, as Matthew is suggesting, I think, for opening things up, because a description can never, no matter how analytically ambitious or seemingly, encompassing of its object of description, it can never be adequate by definition, because there can be another one that would be equally accurate in its way. That is, to touch on just as many points in the thing being described as the first description did.
And is there conflict in this description in this information science of more descriptions, or the descriptions, do they allow for each other? Are they incommensurable?
Well, I'm not in that field, but my sense is the two are simply allowed to carry on, and then you let whatever consequences follow from each one without trying to make a predetermined choice, or a premature choice between them.
The only other thing that I would say is that what's behind all of that, though, is whenever possible, an affiliation with the most extreme form of leftism that you can find at all times.
That's what you should aim for?
You should do that. But then your method is just describe things. But the real world that actually exists, you would need to affiliate with the most extreme form of leftist activity you can find.
That's not so easy to define, to define.
Well, it's not
itself.
neoliberal. It would not be a neoliberal life at Whole Foods.
But can I ask, do you see no contrast between that politic and that discursive politic?
No, I don't.
Yeah.
And I think, and I may be wrong.
Yeah.
And I'm happy to hear someone explain why that doesn't work.
Okay.
Yeah. You may be right.
Can I just say something there, because I
maybe
think
break into this closing loop over here.
Well, I find it very intriguing, because in a way I find it refreshing that we've moved from a discussion at the very beginning about what it was to find meaning, or certainly that word meaning was being sort of mobilized, to which I feel quite removed, and obviously to mobilize description or a tactic of redescription is very different from the task of finding meaning, or actually, I don't know whether you would agree with this, Matthew, but the task, or our critical task, being to find some explanatory system for how things have come to be as they are, but actually to link that to a kind of fiction function where somebody, for instance, Freud, could be seen as generative, as a great novelist of the 19th century, rather than as a figure who offers us an explanatory system. That seems to me not an admission of our depleted stakes, but a potentially generative set of possibilities. It may be the best that we can do in the circumstances which are unpropitious. In that sense, you could call it realist, but it is not an admission of there being no possibilities. So I don't think it's a melancholic position. And I feel, you know, against the tide, in a way, of our own discussions, it's very important to keep that in mind. However, each of us sees, you know, the possibility of the, you know, survival of art or thinking about art in conditions that really wouldn't obviously lend themselves to that survival. Or
just before we go to questions, I wanted to throw something else out that goes back to the morning and the idea of these different formations that generated, you know, a new art history, a newly intellectually ambitious art history. You know, the UCLA, the CUNY October, the OU. And noticing, though, that of the three, UCLA and the OU were mostly involved with the art of the past. It was explaining the art of the past. And the CUNY October moment was about contemporary art, about artists the same age, roughly, as many of the interpreters. So I thought of that when you brought up Tricarton. And, you know, we're now, in the field is in the throes of worries about whether contemporary art is really a subject, whether you can write dissertations on it, how near to the present is it permissible to find a dissertation subject, and so on. But might there be a way to not hang back from that and feel, you know, worried and feel aversion toward the contemporary, but say what we need now is a group, at least, of critics and people getting art history PhDs for whom Tricarton is their main object, and then extend that to a complex of artists. Would that be possible? And would that be the way forward, a way of getting away from the treading water position that Rob was talking about just now? So I'll just leave that, and we should turn to the audience.
Thanks very much. And one thing I ask is that when all this complex of moments that surrounds the work of art, don't forget the Rochester moment. It may have been a little bit later in the 80s, but it's where Crimp and Owens both taught and often lectured. But I have a different kind of question, which is about thinking of why we're even looking at these texts today. And it has something to do, and I can't quite articulate it, but with the rhythms, the swings, the power of anachronisms. Of course, anachronism has its negative, I guess you could call it, effects, that asking a work from the 80s, whether it's Crimp or Owens or Krauss, asking the work to meet our intellectual demands today is a bit silly. However, a text that's 30 years old, we still want to read these. Now, you know, what is it about them that makes us turn to them and make them as much about our present as their present? Yes, some of them, maybe it's the difference that Hal's trying to get at between historiography and theory. Yes, we can look at it historiographically to understand this particular moment in the 1980s, but we can also look at it theoretically in the present. What's it doing for us today? I mean, most of the texts from the 80s have long since plunged into oblivion, or even worse, into banality. But these texts come streaking across our universe still, like a comet, trailing live sparks behind them, clearly sparking debate about them. What does it say about anachronism? What's it say about these particular texts? What's it say about us and our selection of the text from this particular moment in the history of art.
Sorry, I just have to say, I mean, I love the idea of anachronism, and I think the power of anachronism and the anachronistic is much underrated. And I think that sense of the, you know, it's a bit like thinking about the artwork, you know, what is it to say that the meaning of that artwork, or whatever we want to say about it, is attached to the moment of its production? It's quite a kind of odd idea, it seems to me, that your interest in that object should be its, say, my Lydia Clark, its kind of 1964-ness, as opposed to the many, each day, our present, our tomorrow, or, you know, the life that it will lead. And obviously texts have those afterlives in the same way, and one reads them entirely differently, like one reads any kind of literary text. Their contingency is such that they have that capacity to, you know, to be anachronistic, as it were.
I'm really interested in the question, and it connects for me to something that has been at stake in this entire discussion panel here this afternoon, which is whether you might be in a position to take a critical text from an earlier period that's looking at a specific problematic and deploy that in relation to something else. And to take the example of the text of Rosalind Krauss, it seemed to me that the way in which that text undoes a hierarchy, you know, questions the hierarchy of originality and repetition, and you know, that poses a question that's useful for us. That question bears upon the problem of gender for some of us, so it lends itself to a set of possibilities that really have nothing to do with Rosalind Krauss's starting point, but it remains very useful. The notion of repetition then bears upon the idea of the non-reproductive, which in the domain of the investigation of the social and sexuality is very interesting, and it has significance for us. So we continue to explore that, the notion of seriality as potentially exceeding originality and reproduction, and how then that might bear upon the social and the psychic implications of that. It seems to me that there's a lot that we have, that we still have need of from that text, and if you don't still keep the text and think about the moves that it made and the resources of deconstruction that it was using to make those moves, then it's very hard to work with the implications that it has, but those implications are still significant for us now. So I think, you know, just the importance of using things for purposes that might be different from the ones for which they were originally made would be my thought about your question.
I just would say quickly, I don't read these texts, most of them in class, and I don't read them for myself just because there's, you know, we, and to, in the spirit of Matthew's offer of freedom to walk away, there are things that I find more relevant or descriptive of the period or more engaging. So just that not everyone, this is not what everyone is reading, and that may continue, I think, over the next 10 years.
Yeah, I just want to say I really like Mingyong's point that we can use these texts in ways that may even go against those things that we don't like about them. Historically, for myself, I've done that with some of Owens's work, but maybe not with Krauss's as much. But it's worth thinking about for sure, absolutely.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's a wonderful question, and I mean, it suggests to a certain degree a kind of correspondence between these texts and the works of art, because of course the fate of works of art have a similar, some fall into oblivion and some return, and we find relevance in them. And part of me thinks, well, the reason that we still read Greenberg and we read Krauss and we don't perhaps read, I hate to name names because, but the name that came up, and it's actually someone who I always get insights from when I read his works, Irving Sandler. If you just want to know how people were thinking about 60s art, it's a good source. But it seems the difference is that a text like even Greenberg, who, we like to disparage, I think one would say there is a worldview, there's a position that is inherent in almost anything he writes, so that as you're reading it, or Krauss for certain, that it's not just description. It is actually a kind of philosophical statement that has these kind of holes and gaps, so that's why it's generative, whereas the pure description, you use as secondary evidence, right? And of course, these Greenberg and Krauss can become historical evidence, just as, name your favorite work of art that you think, is always going to be relevant. Ulysses by Joyce. It is evidence about something that's going on in early 20th century Europe. And yet at the same time, to say that it doesn't have any relevance beyond being a historical document seems rather perverse and against, I believe, what we as art historians or humanists would believe.
Just one other point really quickly, Michael. I think this was the first text in this October Nexus that opened onto history. It was the first mobilization of a theoretical model that had art historical reach. I mean, she reaches back to Rodin, for example. And that is an avenue that Krauss developed in subsequent texts. So the figure who's famous for the reinscription of the theory versus history or structure versus genesis opposition in art critical and art historical circles actually overrode that binarism in some of her own work in ways that were very productive for the rest of us. And one of the points of sadness, and sadness can be generative too, that this panel is that we've in a way reinscribed that opposition in theory and history.
Yeah, or not. We've not succeeded in opening it up sufficiently, and we've got one more session, and we may, be able to do that before the day is over. Another question?
I have two questions, but one of them is really fast. The first is for Matthew. It's actually just maybe a response. To me, it seems really like schizophrenic and kind of alienating to imagine a world where I'm taking no position in my work, but being as leftist as possible and radical in my avoidance of Whole Foods or whatever in my life. I imagine you're being performatively polemical. I'd love to hear more about that idea. For the rest of the group, I thought it was, so in this session it seems like there was a lot of recourse to this idea of the experience of subjects, whether viewing subjects or critics. Certainly in the Ludekin, maybe in this reading of the Krauss. I thought it would be very clarifying and interesting to me to sort of break down how empiricism plays out in so many of these texts. I read The Rose for the first time. I found it really interesting. She does this really interesting maneuver where she's sort of moving into this idea of this sort of post-structural relationship of the internal psyche, where you're no longer dealing with what she calls a Saussurean description of the psychoanalytic. Definitely the Latour is reclaiming a certain type of relationship to empirical statements of fact. And then I don't know if we're going to get to hear about the Bohm on indeterminacy, but now maybe it would be a good time to hear a little bit about that too.
A little bit about Bohm. Yeah, it's a casualty really of our being squeezed for time and having done the Bohm last night, and I think it opens on to a whole continent that might be beyond our abilities to summarize. I'll try to run a little interference for Jim on this one. But the other part of the question, anybody want to, of course it was directed to Matthew, but there may be others who wish to speak.
Well, I'm in favor of positions. I'm just not in favor of disputing with other people their positions. I have positions, but it's just not, to me, it doesn't seem particularly critically useful to dispute positions. We have to have a certain, from my point of view, realism about what we're doing. We're art historians.
The funniest guy always wins. Matthew, let me just clarify what you. No, I'm happy to be a discourse performer or whatever you want me to be, but let me just make clear the model that you propose. I mean, some of us. Oh, you don't want. No, it's fine. I mean, you seem so wounded when we want to make you make sense.
Go for it.
Well, no, I think what you propose is a really different model from the ones that romantically some of us used in the past, which is the essay, the event, whatever you want to call it, as a critical intervention, as we used to say. You want no part of such engagement in the present. I mean, your events, your performances, and our literal speed should be mentioned, I think, as descriptions of a present that somehow is beyond intervention for reasons that you should tell us more about. I mean, politically, historically. But, you know, your performance as a time capsule for a future that will arrive someday that will need these documents somehow. And it strikes me as, you have a deep cathexis with your own field, but here the cathexis is not Soviet, it seems Russian, 19th century Russian. You know, a sense of a present that is so bogged down and needs to be projected madly into the future. No, it's a great utopian tradition, but this is really your project, and it's so different. No, it has nothing to do with psychoanalysis. It's just, as you say, a description of your performance right now and other performances of yours that I've seen. And I just wanted to highlight the way in which it's very different from the romance, which I might agree with you that it's a romance, of the idea of critical intervention, that people like us, that these texts matter at all.
Was that a question? Did the text?
No, just the difference between intervention and your time capsule for the future.
Yeah, what you just said, I absolutely agree with. I mean, and undoubtedly the kind of, if you, just to be excessively particular, the mix of that late 19th century Russian culture, which you very accurately describe, is probably one of the most bizarre models, because all of these different forms of knowledge were mixed together in bizarre ways. Malevich is the primary exemplar of what could happen, and then the other one would be the Bolshevik Revolution. So that's why I'm more inclined in that direction, probably. But honestly, I've never thought of it in that way.
Next question.
At this point, I just wanted to clarify this for myself again, because Matthew, to ally yourself with the most radical leftist position that you can find in late 19th century Russia, that is anarchism. I'm currently doing research on this. If you were, like I do, now to live in Berlin, you wouldn't have the option to go to Whole Foods. You would have the option to align yourself with a new form of anarchism that involves bombs. Is that what you have in mind? Yep. Which anarchism is.
No.
Okay, then modify that statement at least somewhat, what the most radical leftist position is you can find.
The most radical leftist position you can assume, for me, I would only say for me, is whenever you have a microphone, say that you support whatever's the most left-wing position that you can find. because that shows that somebody can get in front of people and say, global state communism is where we're heading, and it's going to happen someday, not anytime soon. That's my opinion.
Yeah, I ask you to be, you asked us to be real about our position as art historians. I guess we have to be real about our politics as well.
Right, but that's what I'm saying. I just said global state communism. That is never going to happen. But that is what I honestly think we're heading toward.
Global state
communism. Yeah.
We have global state capitalism.
Right. Just one word. One word changed. It'll be great.
Can I just ask one quick question? I know we've got to wrap things up, but I just want to ask whether, Brian, he talked about the prospect of description somehow severed or separated from the prospect of making meaning. And I'm just wondering if that's a possibility.
No, well, let me modify slightly. Not modify, it's not a compromise, but my understanding of description is, I guess, rather different from Matthew's in the light of how things have panned out, because I guess I'm assuming, as a good Baxendalian, that all description presupposes some interpretation and some that it cannot be pure or innocent or naive. And I think there's a great power in description. There's an even greater power in redescription. So I like that word, and I think redescription has, art redescribes other art. Texts redescribe other texts, and they can do so against what they're actually saying. And so what you're calling performative, and maybe I wouldn't want to call performative, I think, what is happening, that's something that we have to track. It's a kind of, choreography that we can track. So in that's absolutely.